I call Kevin Haig.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been an interesting debate so far, very wide-ranging and occasionally tangential. The Green Party generally welcomes this bill. It seems to us that it's obvious that our legislation ought to keep up with a fast-changing field in which New Zealand has both domestic and international obligations. I've studied nuclear physics as far as stage 2, Mr. Speaker, but I'm far from an expert, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the experts have to say about the actual content of the bill at the Select Committee, which I'll be pleased to serve on. There is no reason, sir, why we shouldn't be passing legislation to complete our implementation of the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, or our agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And indeed, this ought to have been done quite some time ago, sir. I don't think there's much that we need to worry about in relation to international monitoring of our compliance with production and use of nuclear technology. And we also welcome the provisions updating penalties for lack of compliance from the 1965 level, a maximum fine of $10,000 to a much more reasonable $500,000. Incidentally, I think 1965 was the year of Yesterday from the Beatles, also Nowhere Man, I'll Follow the Sun. If only Brendan were here. So while we welcome the updating of the legislation, Mr. Speaker, the extraordinary degree of harmony in the House over the content of the bill makes it all the more puzzling that it's taken so long for this entirely non-controversial yet urgent bill to actually reach this point. Slow and steady progress, Simon O'Connor says. Well, certainly slow. As for steady, I think we'd have to wait and see. When the regulatory impact statement for this bill was produced back in 2004, the review of the existing legislation, the Radiation Protection Act 1965, noted primarily that the legislation does not enable the regulation of non-ionising radiation and practices involving exposure to naturally occurring sources of radiation. This is inconsistent with the Australian National Directory for Radiation Protection. New Zealand is a member of the panel developing the directory. It's a quote from the statements here. Now, we don't know why exactly the recommendation to include non-ionising radiation was not pursued by the government. And Simon O'Connor in his contribution argued that that was kind of self-evident. Well, Mr. Speaker, really the only difference between ionising radiation and non-ionising radiation is in the level of energy. Is the level of energy in the radiation sufficient to dislodge electrons from the orbit of an atom? Well, Mr. Speaker, that seems to be a fairly slender basis on which to distinguish in the New Zealand legislation. Barbara Currigan, her contribution just now said that the principal use of ionising radiation was in the health sector, and indeed there's significant use in the health sector. But Mr. Speaker, I'd argue that actually the greatest use is actually in probably the houses of most members of Parliament, in smoke alarms, which all contain pretty much a radioactive isotope of americium. These are subject to the bill, and yet the solaria or tanning beds that some of us, no doubt, might use on occasion are not. Well, there seems, Mr. Speaker, to be no rational basis for that difference. Mr. Speaker, so what non-ionising radiation has been covered, is used in technology from MRIs to microwave ovens and lasers, and also, of course, in cell phones and Wi-Fi work on radio frequencies that are regulated by New Zealand safety standards. As the bill sets out for ionising radiation, non-ionising radiation can also be both helpful and also very harmful. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no rational reason for distinguishing these two forms of radiation and saying we're going to regulate one by statute and the other through standards. Simply doesn't make any sense. So let me disabuse you, Mr. Speaker, and indeed disabuse the House of the notion before it begins that the Greens want to regulate all forms of radiation. That's not only literally impossible, but also undesirable. However, if we are passing legislation controlling the safe use of radiation, there is no reason for us not to also be exploring the safe use of non-ionising radiation as well as of ionising radiation, just as Australia has done, sir. So in Australia, provisions in legislation are aimed at only controlling the harmful effects of non-ionising radiation and currently are used, for example, in the setting that has already been mentioned this evening, the regulation of sunbeds. Interestingly, when in New Zealand, when a review of existing legislation was undertaken in 2003, a submission to the Ministry of Health from the Cancer Society asked for exactly the same provisions as exist in the Australian legislation to decrease our very high rate of skin cancers. And Mr. Speaker, as others have mentioned this evening, the Health Committee has been hearing many submissions relating to salaria and sunbeds in relation to the Health Protection Amendment Bill that Simon O'Connor has mentioned. Now that bill contains an age limit currently of 18 and essentially puts in practice a code of practice that's currently voluntary and makes it a mandatory code of practice. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to talk too much about the submissions that we've heard, but my contention to the House is that the Health Committee, which has now finished hearing evidence on the bill, that the Health Committee has not heard any evidence to support an age of 18. The evidence that we have heard all supports, in fact, taking the same kind of action that Australian states have taken and banning these things altogether. What I'm saying, sir, is just the strength of evidence of the harmful effects of non-ionising radiation make the argument that's used to justify the provisions of this bill equally applicable to non-ionising radiation, sir. There seems to be no reasonable basis for the alternative approach that the government has preferred, which in fact is a hodgepodge of different regulations and safety standards rather than a consistent approach to regulating the harm associated with non-ionising radiation. Mr. Speaker, it's agreed that certain forms of non-ionising radiation, such as UV light, high-intensity lasers, can have harmful biological effects. It's recognised, for example, by the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection, who produced the advice used by our Ministry of Health, that, for example, static magnetic fields can cause biological interactions such as vertigo and other sensory perceptions, such as nausea, visual sensations and a metallic taste in the mouth, as well as the possibility of acute neurocognitive effects. Mr. Speaker, it seems bizarre that the approach preferred by this government will see the X-ray machine in the radiology department of a New Zealand hospital regulated by this bill, but the MRI just down the corridor not regulated by the bill. And Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this bill, but listening with great interest to the submissions at the Select Committee and wanting to know why this same standard of safety ought not to be extended to non-ionising radiation. Thank you, sir. Okay.